Welcome to the Proactive Security Podcast with Mike Hodges and Brine Hamilton. This podcast is dedicated to discussing violence prevention in healthcare. We want to inform, equip, and empower healthcare security leaders to prevent violence before it happens. And now, here's your hosts, Mike and Brine.
Hey everybody, I'm Mike.
And I'm Brine.
And this is the Proactive Security Podcast, episode 4.
And today we'll be talking about collaboration and communication. We're going to introduce a couple of new terms, operational engagement and operational integration. It goes a little bit deeper. So I guess, Mike, we'll start off with operational engagement. If you want to explain that for everybody listening.
Yeah, so operational engagement and operational integration, just both together, for me, help really amplify the thought processes behind what collaboration and communication are. You know, when we talk about collaboration and communication, we're talking about working with other people. We're talking about communicating effectively, both in the way we send and receive messages, and both of those things are critical. But when we take operational engagement and operational integration as two separate terms, we take those terms and really expound upon the idea of collaboration and communication in effective ways. So operational engagement is really about expanding the capability of our security forces through the communication to and involvement of all staff in our active operations. So we look at how we expand our capabilities and how we bring in others that are not necessarily security, but bring them into our operations and utilize them in participation through the way we communicate to them. And so it's a really powerful idea of how we really take that security mindset that people talk about all the time and extrapolate that across all spectrums of employees within our facilities.
That's a real force multiplier, because this kind of takes see something, say something to an even deeper level.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
This really extends or increases the impact that the public safety department's able to have on operations just by using the resources that we already have in place.
Yeah. I think you can simplify the concept really well when you utilize examples. So, one of the things that I find is a really good example when I'm teaching our staff about this concept is to use entering auto thefts, right? So, one of the things that we can do is through the engagement of all staff. So remember our definition: operational engagement, expanding capability through the communication to and involvement of all staff in security operations. So one of the things we talk about is if we are, through our regular daily work, monitoring an uptick in thefts from vehicles in our parking decks, right? This is something that happens routinely across organizations, especially in urban areas. So we start communicating that, hey, everybody needs to know we're seeing an uptick in entering auto thefts. We're seeing them during these times of day. We're seeing them during these days of the week. Whatever the information is that we have, we share that information, and then we add to that, right? We always add to the security tips. And hey, guys, don't forget, keep your valuables out of sight. Make sure you lock your doors when you leave your vehicle. Make sure you report suspicious activity if you see it in the parking decks. So all of those things. So the first part is we're enabling them to understand what's going on. And then the second part of that is we're engaging them in the process of providing for their own security. And so, yeah, absolutely. You use the word right on the money, force multiplication, right? We just took something and utilized it to extend our capacity and our capability far beyond what we would otherwise be able to do. So we shared information and we expanded our capability because we involved that staff in providing for their own security and helping to solidify that security mindset.
That's a really thorough explanation. So let's take a step back and focus more on workplace violence prevention and how the concept applies in terms of workplace violence prevention. How do we apply it in those terms?
Sure. I think that's a good question. I think when you talk about we talk about things like entering auto thefts, it's that in a lot of ways that can be a pretty straightforward example. And certainly there can be complexities with property crimes like that. But when we get into violence prevention, I think, one of the big things that I like to utilize in violence prevention methodology is a standardized threat level process, right? So So we can identify and classify threats with very specific levels that are predefined that everybody understands. So, in our facility, we use 4 threat levels: low, medium, high, and critical level threats, because we're super creative with our naming conventions. But a low level threat, we know through our education programs for our employees, and through our pre-definition and the work we've done there, we know that a low-level threat is a minor disruption to facility operations, low potential for violence. Medium-level threat is very disruptive, no verified history of violence. A high-level threat is highly disruptive, verified history of violence. And a critical level threat is an immediate threat to life safety, right? So because we have these predetermined and pre-educated, and everybody's familiar with this common vernacular around threat levels, we can utilize that in the way we leverage operational engagement. So we say, we can put information out at the beginning of shifts to say, hey, we have a high level threat subject in this room on this floor right now. And so now immediately we've engaged everybody with the knowledge this person is very disruptive and has a verified history of violence against staff. So already we've equipped them with information. Now, again, because we've put the work into developing these standardized threat levels, we can add to that, right? When you say, okay, hey, we've got a high level threat in room 2202. Remember to go in the room with a partner. Don't go in the room alone. Contact security staff if there's any sign of escalation, et cetera, et cetera. And we can put those preventative mechanisms in place and now engage that employee in their own protection as they're dealing with that patient. Whether that patient has criminal intent or whether the violence is, like most often it is, a result of disease progression, we know high level threat. And here are the key protective measures you can take as an employee to make sure that you're not a victim of violence as a result of that. So now we've operationally engaged them in providing for their own protection, as well as extending our own kind of eyes and ears around that particular subject.
The one thing that you touched on there too was eliminating the victimization, or even victim mentalities. I guess you can kind of think of those in terms of those lines of thinking. The other thing is too, this kind of the way that the teams are communicating, it functions almost like a tip line, if you will.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really opens up, and this is something that I found to be uniquely gratifying, I guess, is as we started regular communication on threat levels. When threats were identified and we classified those threats, we started regular communication. We talked about them quite often in our daily safety huddles. So facility leadership would come together. You have clinical leadership, medical leadership, ancillary leadership all together and say, hey, these are the issues we've had over the last 24 hours. And so I started communicating them there and saying, hey, by the way, guys, we've got, 2 low level threats in these rooms and a medium level threat here and 2 high level threats here. Don't forget, this is what that means, and use these precautionary measures as a result. Well, after a couple of weeks of doing that, one of the things that really kind of blew me away was I had a nurse manager come to me after our safety huddle was over, said, hey, Mike, let me make sure that you're tracking the patient in room 3440. I was like, oh, well, what's going on with that patient? Well, that patient has been very, very verbally aggressive with our staff, and a lot of the nurses are just scared to deal with him. You think your guys could come up and check on it? Man, absolutely. Absolutely, we can. That's exactly what we're here for. And so now there's a patient that had a potential for violence in our facility. It was not on security's radar at all.
Right.
We're now having those individuals reported to us because we've built confidence in the fact that we're tracking these folks and we're providing solutions that mitigate violence to dealing with these patients, and doing it in a way that's both beneficial to the individual employee and maintaining their safety, but also beneficial to the quality of care that's being provided for that patient. And so now, yeah, they're sharing that information with us. And we all know tip lines are great. Tip lines are things that we utilize constantly in security and law enforcement spheres. But that it's that concept of self-reporting, like, oh, hey, I need to make sure that security knows about this. We've broken down a significant barrier to violence prevention if we can enable that kind of behavior and that kind of self-reporting.
Excellent. Yeah, that really turns it into obviously what we intend to do here, but it turns it into a proactive approach.
Absolutely. That proactive engagement is huge to mitigating the violence. Yeah.
Now, Mike, let's look at the second piece of that, the operational integration. Let's take a delve into that. What exactly is operational integration?
Yeah, operational integration. So that's the kind of the the brother to, right, the sibling concept to operational engagement. And so we've touched on it a little bit already. But the operational integration, if you want to understand the definition of that, is it is the integration of security operations into clinical care in order to provide for the safety of staff as well as the overall improvement of patient care environment. So it is all about the concept of us integrating security services into the overall care environment. It's that full integration into the clinical care process for the patient, so that we can not only protect the staff but we can improve the care. And so a lot of that is built around a lot of these operational engagement processes. So when we think about that example of reporting in safety huddle, well, when that nurse started engaging back with me, that nurse manager started engaging back with me on reporting incidents that were on her floor that had not otherwise been reported to security. Well, now we've started seeing integration occur, right? And so we really start to enable that full extension of our security capabilities through operational engagement and now operational integration, because not only do we have conversations, in the first conversation it was just, hey, can you put this person on your radar? Well, now we're having conversations a little bit further along. So it's like, well, let's get a group together and make sure security's there to talk about what's the plan of care for this patient. We have a patient who's, extremely violent with our staff, and maybe they have some type of advanced disease progression that's causing that violence. But we have this individual, we know they're extremely violent, we know they're extremely belligerent. We need to provide for the staff and their safety while we're still caring for this patient. So let's start talking about what the plan of care is, and we need security in that discussion, helping us discuss the violence mitigation measures that are going to be most effective given this scenario. And so now we've gone beyond just engagement, and now we're fully integrated into the clinical care for that patient. And that's a game changer in violence prevention. When you start involving your public safety teams, your security teams in the discussion about clinical care for the patient, so that everybody's not only on the same page, but fully engaged in the concerns and issues associated with that particular subject.
Right. Yeah, the communication is a huge piece. I know there's a management saying that kind of goes, well, the way it goes is, you say something 7 times, half of your audience will say that you said it once. So
Yep.
it's hard in these situations to really over communicate. So in terms of that, what are some of the other ways that we can continue to communicate that message?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Repetition is key, right? You gotta say the message over and over and over again. And it is in so many ways a cultural change, right? You can't just have that kind of rote repetition. It is about saying it enough so that we adopt it and internalize it into our culture as an organization. As far as like tools that enable that kind of communication, that operational integration, I already talked about, reporting and safety huddle. I think that is one of the most pivotal things you can do as a healthcare security leader is to make a report in the safety huddle environment that's going to be effective in sharing information, right? So one of the things, when we talk about like the format that we utilize, we talk about the total number of patients that we're tracking on a daily basis. And then we usually subdivide those out, like in the number in the emergency department and the number of inpatient that we're tracking. We talk about, like I said, the number of low-level threats in the house, the number of medium-level threats, the number of high-level threats, et cetera. And then we talk about those other issues that pop up. And so, like a good example would be, for one of my safety huddle reports would be something super simple, but hey, we're tracking 8 patients today. We got 2 in the emergency department, 6 in patients. 4 of those have some threat classification. Got 1 low level threat in this room, 3 medium level threats in this room. And additionally, we've had an uptick in local entering auto thefts. Please remind your staff to lock their vehicles and keep valuables out of sight. Man, in that one little report, as short as that is, I've now engaged every leader in my organization who's operationally involved in how that facility runs today, in thinking about where our threats for violence are, the fact that we've got security concerns in the park index, and all of them have a role to play in that process. And so, that communication is critical, and it happens every day, and it's operationally relevant. I think another big piece of that is proactive patrolling, is what I call proactive patrolling, which is the process of really engaging consistently with our surroundings as we have our officers patrol through, right? So I define proactive patrolling by looking at it as the process of having our officers on the front line constantly changing their patrol focuses and the areas that they're focused on for patrol based on the operational need. So, we look at operational need as defined by a multitude of factors, but things like the number and location of high-risk patients, the number and location of criminal activity, the identified security vulnerabilities in the facility on any specific day, all of those things, and we're tracking that, right? So we're tracking that on a regular basis, and as a result, we change our patrol focuses. And so, we may have 3 high-level threats on the 4th floor today, and tomorrow we don't have any because they were discharged, and now we've got to shift our focus. So we're constantly engaging with new areas. So we're leveraging operational intelligence to really lead us to put our resources where they matter. And in that process, in the proactive patrolling process, we're constantly engaging, right? We're talking to the staff that are present. We are connecting with the nurse leaders on the floors, with the bedside nurses at the bedside, with the patient care techs. And we're constantly having discussions about, hey, how is our high level threat in room 2202? Have you had any issues this morning? Is there any escalation patterns that we need to be aware of? That kind of information is passing back and forth in such a way that we're constantly integrated into the conversation about what's going to happen with that patient. And I think, those kinds of communication methods really help us not only integrate with the care for that patient, but expand our capabilities beyond anything we previously could have imagined.
Right. And I think that segues nicely into the security threat assessment, just that piece in itself. What's that whole process look like?
Yeah, so the security threat assessment process is a really fascinating conversation starter more than anything else, right? So when we put together our security threat assessment team process, the whole idea was, let's get a few people that are critical to the care for this patient huddled at or near the bedside so that we can have a quick conversation about what our concerns are, assign a relevant threat level to those concerns, and then execute in coming up with a mitigation plan for how we're going to provide care for this patient given those concerns. And so, in the threat assessment process, basically what we're doing in our facility, this is led by our frontline security team. So we may have an officer who's responding to a call for assistance with a patient who's, being verbally aggressive, right? So when they come up, they say, hey, we've got a verbally aggressive patient. We go through the situation, we deal with the situation. After the fact, that officer can grab the bedside nurse, the charge nurse, if we need to, maybe the social worker for the floor, or some other folks that could be pulled in depending on need, and say, hey, let's have a quick conversation about what just happened with this patient. We had some verbal aggression. What are the other concerns associated with it? Hey, nurse so and so from the bedside, what has your experience been with the patient so far? Is this abnormal? Is this something that's serious? And we can go through a process of looking at the kind of disruption to operations that we see. We can look at the type of potential acting out behavior that we're seeing, whether it's verbal or potentially physical. We can look at, identify if any threats were made or if there's been any threats involving the use of weapon or if we have a history of violence with that subject. We can look at sometimes, you and I both know sometimes the patient is fine, but it's the family members that are the problem. So let's
Yeah.
look at the type and number of family members that we're dealing with that could be causing the potential for violence. And let's categorize that in such a way that we can identify is this a low potential for violence, medium, high, critical, and then based on that assessment done, right there at the bedside with the clinical staff, we can now have a conversation about, okay, we've all identified this as a medium level threat. Let's look at ways we can make sure this stops here at verbal aggression and doesn't get any further. And so what can the clinical staff do? Let's ask some questions. What are some things we can do from a medical perspective to help this patient remain calm and remain, not have any continuing issues? What are some things we can do from the security perspective? Can we increase rounding? Can we, have limit setting conversations? What are some other things that we can do? Can the social worker get involved? What can we do from a social work perspective? And let's come up with a collaborative plan of care so that we really are taking care of this patient to the best of our abilities while mitigating the potential for violence. And I think, the best part of that entire tool, and this is what I tell my staff all the time, is the security threat assessment process. It allows us to identify a threat. It allows us to mitigate violence. Those are great, but that's not what it was designed for. The security threat assessment process is designed to make sure you, security person, are talking to you, bedside nursing person, and having a collaborative conversation about how we care for this patient so that we're integrating, and we get back to our operational integration, we're integrating ourselves effectively into clinical care so that we can mitigate violence.
And how important is the follow-up?
You know, um, i- it's the bedrock of the whole thing, right? We can have great conversations, or we can have that conversation relevant to preventing violence for that particular patient. Come up with an elaborate plan about how we're going to mitigate violence. And if we don't ever follow up on it, well, it's a moot point. We just wasted our time. We spent 20 minutes at the bedside talking through something. We could have just gone back downstairs and had a snack. It would have been much better. But when we talk about incident follow-up, we've got to be continually following up on incidents and continually following up on assessments and making sure that we're closing the loop, right? So if we come up with a plan, that's great, but we've got to be able to follow up on that plan effectively so that we're executing the plan. Right. And that, when you talk about management, that's one of the first things you talk about is your plan can be pristine, but if nobody follows through with it, then it's a moot point, right? There again, you might as well have gone and got yourself a snack, would have been much more effective. So, we've got to follow up. And so we've got to have support for that. If we follow through with something like a security threat assessment, or if we're checking in on a patient through our proactive patrolling processes and somebody says, hey, we need to be paying attention, but then they never see us come back and pay attention, well, then what's the point? In the same way, if we have an active incident of violence, right? If we have an assault and nobody follows up with that victim, well, that's cold, man. That's the organization is demonstrating that it does not care at all that this happened to you. And that's not the kind of environment we want to establish for our staff. And, the other side of incident follow-up is that if you aren't following up effectively with people that you employ, that you put in harm's way through the process of connecting them with this patient who then has assaulted them or has otherwise threatened them in a way that has made them fear for their safety, well, then what's the point of them working for you, right?
Right.
We've got to be able to provide victim support and demonstrate that we care that this is happening and that this happened to you individual, and that we're going to be here to support you 100% of the way.
Now, the other thing too that we tend to come back to a lot is just because of how important it is education and training. Now, do you use any of these opportunities, or does your team use any of these opportunities to do maybe some impromptu training or education, maybe some hip pocket training or even some in-service training as they're doing their proactive patrolling?
No, I think that's awesome, man. I love the fact that you brought up the term hip pocket training. It's one of my favorite terms. Um, I I tell my staff, man, that every incident that occurs, you should be debriefing after that incident, and that is a prime time for some level of hip pocket training. To be like, hey, you know what? This happened, and it sucked, and this is how we went through it, and let's learn from that. So, what are some things we can take away from this incident to help us be better the next time? One of the guiding principles for our organization is tactical excellence, and in all that we do, we pursue tactical excellence, which means in every encounter, we want our response to this incident to be better than our response to the last incident, right? So we're constantly seeking to improve. So if we're constantly seeking to improve, well, that means at the end of every incident, we've got to analyze that on some level. And it doesn't have to be overly complex, right? But we've got to be able to say, hey, these were the good things that we saw. These were the bad things that we saw. The bad things we saw, we're going to improve upon. The good things we saw, we're going to reinforce. And let's use that so that we all learn. And if we can do that not only with ourselves as security professionals, but include, through that operational integration thought process, the clinical staff, man, we're just going to be continuing that force multiplication process.
Absolutely. Now, I guess the last thing we kind of want to touch on is reporting. So, as far as your environment of care and physical environment reporting, how does that process look?
Yeah, so I think, this ties us in with the discussion we had last time, right, where we talked about being a business enabler.
Yep.
And so one of the things we've got to be constantly doing is leveraging our data to tell the story. And so, you're reporting to the Environment Care Committee, the Physical Environment Committee, whatever committee, however you call it. The reporting that you do to those committees is critical in helping to tell that story about that business enabling, right? So when we talk about all the things that are occurring in our facility, last month we had this many high-level threats identified in the facility and this many medium level threats identified in the facility. These are things we're pulling from our operational engagement and our operational integration models, and now sharing effectively through data and metrics to environment of care groups so that we can demonstrate not only the reality of the environment that they see, but also pull them into that process and show how we're integrated into being a business enabler, that we're making the environment of care more effective and more high quality because of the engagement and the integration that we have. And so I think those are two key opportunities for telling our story about enabling business well.
Excellent. Now, we went through quite a bit there. Is there anything that we didn't cover adequately?
I can always come up with something else to talk about. But I think, ultimately what we're talking about, right, is collaboration and communication. And so, in understanding operational engagement and operational integration, we really bring some horsepower into how we collaborate and communicate well. And I think that's the kind of key takeaway. If we can understand how we expand our capability, right, through the communication to and involvement in of all staff and security operations, and how we integrate ourselves as security professionals into the clinical care for our patients so that we provide for the safety of our staff and the overall improvement of the patient care environment. Both of those things are going to just bring tremendous weight to how we collaborate and how we communicate, and really help us transition from where we are to a whole new level of operation.
Well, thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Proactive Security Podcast. By the time we meet again, it will be the new year. It'll be 2021. So I just want to wish everybody a happy new year and a Merry Christmas, or a happy holiday if you celebrate something else. Until next time, stay proactive.